Welcome everybody to another episode of Sustainable Latam, a podcast that focuses on the geopolitics, economic and social trends in Latin America. With me, as always, I have Andrew Thompson, international journalist, and Julian Seydoux, economic analyst, both specialized in Latin America and with a large trajectory working in the region. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me again today. We are going to have a complex analysis of a very interesting week, we can say, because we have got the war in Iran and the impact on the region, but also there was a summit in Miami where 12 Latin American presidents meet President Trump, and there come a lot of actions coming after the summit, and the elections in Colombia that has also reflected a little bit all what is going on. But all these elements are interrelated. There are an economic, regional impact of the war in Iran, but it's also interrelated with what has been happening in Venezuela, the pressure on Cuba, the war on drugs. So we have a lot that is what we can see now interconnected. And I will begin reminding one sentence that Julian says in our latest podcast episode, what it says when you were saying, after we analyzing what is happening in Central America and all the drug offensive that we were seeing in the region, and you're saying there is something bigger here. We don't know exactly yet, but something is developing much bigger than that. And looks like that everything is interconnected. And I will begin with you, Julian. How do you see what is happening now in Iran? How is interconnected in the region? And how do you see the impact in the region?
Well, thank you, Alberto. Well, Iran is a big, well, it's impacting everything across the world and really shifting a lot of the economics. So my general take on the war is that, to summarize briefly, it's positive for oil and gas exporters, which are not in the Middle East, i.e. Russia and Latin American countries that have a lot of the energy resources. It's positive relatively for the US, which was completely self-sufficient altogether. It's really negative for Europe, and it's negative for the economies of the Middle East, of course, with potential escalations there. And it's negative for China, which I think is the main is at the end, the main target here in the roundabout way. So it's a really big thing going on at the moment over there. And so to come back for our favorite countries, it's interesting also to note that that as energy prices go up, then development of oil fields or investments in them make absolute sense, which is a great thing if you have access to, say, new oil fields in Venezuela, and can devote, a building of new infrastructure over there and pipelines and whatever. So it's a really interesting moment. As always, there are people who take the view that they don't understand what the president is doing or saying and whatnot. But more and more, from an economic standpoint, I see evidence that there is a coordinated strategy all across the world. We spoke last week about the the Panama ports being taken over from the Chinese at the same time as the Iranian war. And so the economic impact for the Latin region is actually, in my opinion, for most countries, is actually pretty positive. For Mexico is not so much because they are dependent on energy to some extent, and Central America as well. But for South American countries, there's definitely huge potential there for oil-rich and gas-rich countries, and you can think of Argentina, who's a friend of the US, or has been for some time with the Trump administration. And for Brazil, is an epic moment, of course. And also for the rest of the countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, as mentioned, and certainly, yes, there should be a Latam trade. Buy buy whatever you can get there, from bonds to equities. It's a positive for the region. But at the same time, of course, you have the US presence, which is being felt more and more.
Let's go there. Andrew, from your point of view, Julian is saying, okay, on the economic terms, we are going to see probably a boom because of the oil prices around that. But what happened with those countries, for example, Chile, that is net oil importer, or even big producers like Brazil, that is going to have a boom, but on the other side, the impact, the inflationary pressures that can come because of the oil prices. How do you see this situation? Are we like a double-edged sword here, or and some adjustments we are going to need to see across the region?
I think we are in a double-edged sword situation, definitely. And the key question, there's a war going on right now in Iran. For me, the key question is, for how long? Is this, something that's, as Trump has suggested, is it something that's going to be over in 3 or 4 weeks? Or is it something that's going to last months, and last, if you like, until the end of this year, or even longer? And that question is important because Brazil has, as we know, has general elections in November. If oil prices have been above $100 a barrel, helping Brazilian oil production and exports, but that will also create inflationary pressures inside Brazil. And the last thing you want to do when you're running a presidential election is have prices going up very much. So I think there is a really, really important problem of timing here. And there's also, in a situation of war, sometimes the unexpected happens. It's something that you haven't planned for, and that may cause greater uncertainty. This is not so uncertain, but for example, fertilizer prices depend on oil a lot, and that could have an impact on Brazilian fertilizer imports, Colombian fertilizer imports, and Argentinian fertilizer imports. So it is, I know we say this all the time, or journalists say it all the time, it is a period of heightened uncertainty, and that has an economic cost, which might take a little bit of the shine off the boom in commodity prices, of the positive effects for Latin America.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's move a little bit more the line on the impact on Iran, because I would like to do, we know that everything interrelated, as Julian mentioned pretty well. It begins with Venezuela in a way. Now there is an opportunity to develop the oil fields in Venezuela, probably because of the booming on the prices. But on the other side, we can see the geopolitical or the military implications around. There was a summit on Saturday with President Trump, with 12 Latin American presidents, all Trump supporters or aligned with Trump in one way or another. It's really interesting, the name of the summit, Shield of the Americas, if I'm not wrong, around that. And what is coming around that? An alliance to attack drug trafficking in coordination with military operations with the US. So we are seeing probably a militarization of the drug and wars bigger than what have been seen around that. And this is also a little bit interconnected with all what is happening, because in another element, the US has been trying to work with Latin American governments to put some pressure on monitoring what is going to happen, for example, in the Triple Frontier, trying to say we need to neutralize the assets of Hezbollah, although we don't know how strong or weak is Hezbollah in Latin America, but in the past they have actions around that. So we can see more actions around that. So how do you see with all this interconnection, Andrew? Are we going to see more military operations of the US inside the region?
I should warn you that my answer to this question is quite contradictory. There are two views that seem to pull me in different directions. Number one is that the meeting is not that important and is one of the many, many Latin American federations and alliances and UNASURs and ALVAs and so on, which don't really do that much apart from being a talking shop. So what we have is that 12 heads of state got together in Miami and they issued a joint declaration which called for four things. Number one, more security cooperation. Number two, a whole government approach. Number three, peace through strength. And number four, the formation of an anti-narco terrorism coalition. Now, these things, governments have been saying they're doing something like that anyway for years, and it doesn't really change that much. It's just another talking shop. That's the end of one of my two contradictory views. Contradicting this is that if you like, the driving trend is militarization of the war against crime and drugs, and that is alive and very well. As we know, the US has been bombing small boats said to be carrying drugs across both the Pacific and the Caribbean. It was involved in a bombing raid in Ecuador just this week, and the likelihood of this militarization across the region is high, and that is a major, major development which will have lots of ramifications.
Yeah, just to add from what you're saying of the American intervention, we cannot forget that American intelligence was behind of the killing of El Mencho in Mexico. So there is a clear implications on that. That looks like that the summit maybe is not as important, but it has been a very good show around. But there is a strategy all behind it then. And Julian, perhaps you can go a little bit there, because there is one actor that immediately after Iran, Trump was mentioning a lot, that is Cuba, and says the days of Cuba are counting around that. So Julian, do you think there is a logic in all this American strategy? And are we going to see more actions inside Latin America to get more control in the region by the Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's clear that Latin America is strategic for the US, both south, north, and if you go north as well. So they're really moving around on every single direction, and everything again is to some extent, I see coordination in everywhere. So I just want to come back to one point that Andrew was making, which is about the duration of the war in Iran. I think it's a really important and key point. So today or yesterday, President Trump basically said that the war was now almost complete. The immediate reaction of the market was it went up. It went up, and that was a sign of a good thing. And interestingly enough, on social media we can see that there's a lot of comments about certain trades that were made that were very, very profitable to some people who had extraordinary prescient knowledge about when to buy and when to sell certain things, and that we have seen this repeatedly across all of the action. So there's a lot of show going on at the same time. I will point out to one really big factor here is that right now the US is going towards its midterms. There are lots of things going on behind the scene, seemingly, there's a preparation. The entire administration has been preparing for this for these midterms in a certain way, so that to some extent, or especially the MAGA party, to win the elections. And at the same time, we have this year in 2026 is when you have $8 to $9 trillion of debt, US debt that need to be refinanced. And they need to be refinanced ideally at the preferential prices versus all the others. Now, when you enter into a war or any of big disruption, what usually happens is that you have a flight to quality or to safety. Flight to safety means that you go to the safest place on the planet, which tends to be linked to your military power, or which is the US. So as soon as Trump announced yesterday, that the war was complete, yields of the US fell, treasury yields. But I would say that this is a key indicator that we need to keep a watch on over the next year. I will be very interested to see the exact monthly refinancing needs or when they go to auction and how this is managed to some extent. In terms of what you were mentioning, Andrew, about crime-related activities and how to tackle them and so on, absolutely. I think there's, as I mentioned before, we talked about Central America. I think there's a grab for value from the US and from any organization operating from the US. And that has implication across everything. So the US is right now redefining how it's capturing value. It's agnostic about whether it is through democratic means or through other things. It doesn't really matter. We're still in the logic of US first, and that means that they are trying to, or the administration think that they should be the ones capturing most of the value anywhere where it's operating on any type of trains or business. And I think we are starting to see this across the board. So when we see military action or increased action towards narco trafficking and so on, there's a capture of value somewhere. These changes of paradigm happening. New people need to be replaced. New deals need to be made that we are not aware of, or that we don't understand. We have limited visibility. Some people who may invite later on the podcast may have better insights here. But for me, it's just all across. There's a value capture here. So that's I think these are important things to bear in mind. And for Cuba, it seems to be that there's a type of the ancient Chinese let it go strategy everywhere. The US is moving its pawns, itself in all directions. We saw Venezuela, what comes between Venezuela and the US is Mexico. Mexico's been there's been some action there. We see Panama has been again last couple of weeks ago with the Panama ports, and Cuba is high in the mind of the Secretary of State and
Marco Rubio.
Yeah. Marco Rubio over there, and also of many people who are in the US, who are refugees, understand what's at stake there ahead of the midterms. And so I think there's a high stake there. What's very interesting was that there was this talk about there was a mysterious call between President Trump and Putin recently. Now, what did it say? And suddenly after that call, the Cold War is finished. There's a deal to be made. So everyone's looking at Iran. I'm thinking everyone should be looking at Cuba. Because if you remember, we mentioned when Venezuela happened that similarly there was a summit back in last August or whatever, a couple of months before, which we were mentioning that in this very cynical way of thinking, that what was actually discussed was, one of the big main supporter of Venezuela wasn't China. It's Russia. Russia was really supportive of the Venezuelan regime, who then had its head cut off. And so one has to wonder here what has been said about Cuba. What is going to happen there? So that will be my thinking in looking what's next here. Of course, they're talking about it, so sometimes you just need to listen to what they say and just think that actually is going to happen. That's I think is quite key. So also I would mention, as I mentioned before, one of the big winners of this Iranian war is Russia. Russia, from its energy, from oil export and gas export. Gas is shooting up the roof. But also for, as you mentioned, for fertilizers. One of the main producers of some of the components comes from Russia.
Yeah.
Andrew,
could I?
views?
Yes. I wanted to ask you a question, but shall I answer what you want to know first?
No, go ahead. I want to go with your questions in that case.
my general question is, are we saying that Donald Trump has a decapitation strategy, which started out in Venezuela, continued into Iran with the assassination of the supreme leader, might have been involved in Mexico in the death of El Mencho? Do you think, listening to Julian about Cuba, do you think the State Department or the CIA are currently thinking we need to go the same way, get a friendly person into power in Cuba and work through that new sort of Delcy Rodriguez type figure?
If we are seeing just the news all across the week, and following what Julian was saying, I think we have to look very close to Cuba. We'll go here in a couple of elements. One is the diplomatic front. Really interesting that with the change in Venezuela, and basically all the developments that is going around in the region, suddenly this center-left bloc that exists, for example, in the OAS, that has been blocking American initiatives around that, has been in a way weakening, if not neutralizing in many elements. Suddenly we can see now an OAS on the diplomatic front that probably is going to be more friendly to American interests in that way.
Yes.
And when we're seeing now going on following the news, we know that President Trump has already said that they were in talks with the Cuban leadership, and basically in a very Trumpian way, they're saying Cuba is about to fall. They are eager for an agreement. But the fact is that there is some kind of behind conversation. We know that there was conversations with the son of Raul Castro, who is the de facto leader around that. And yes, probably we can expect a change of some. I'm not sure if it's going to be an military operation. That's way to see. But definitely something is going to go. And I think there is a scenario that we can see in the near or the mid-term future, a change of government in Cuba that is going to be probably more aligned with Trump. Now I will go to one of my questions around, because we have mentioned in Iran, we have mentioned in all what is going on. We still didn't touch a little bit Colombia, but we're going to go later, because I want to go with something that is more important. You mentioned quite correctly that the big players in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, weren't in this summit. Colombia, another big player, weren't in this summit of the Americas, on the one side. But on the other side, we see that there is some kind of pressures around that. And there is another external actor who has interests, but not as big for them. But China is still a big player for Latin Americans, especially for countries like Brazil, going around that. And I'm asking myself from geopolitical terms, what is going to do China with all these changes? Is going to stay quiet around that? Because we know that it's not very big, but from what happened in Iran, what can we expect? That's a little bit speculative, but can we see a little bit more playing in the region between these two bigs as we have been talking around?
I think that China at the moment is playing a sort of "we are your good friends" card in relation to Latin America. I saw a press conference with the Chinese foreign minister who was saying, we will help countries in Latin America. We do not believe in hegemonies. We do not believe in, trampling their rights and so on. So that the official Chinese line, I think, is when we are the anti-militarization party, we're completely different to Trump. In reality, I think that's just a useful posture that China takes, and it will continue trying to increase its influence. I think the argument may be it is more difficult. China has built its influence and its power in Latin America gradually and quietly. Now facing Donald Trump as an adversary, Donald Trump is not quiet. He's not gradual. He makes big announcements, and he's quite aggressive and hostile in his stance. So I'm not quite sure how China will react to that, but they will react. And I think that's something that maybe become clearer over the next couple of months, particularly as things develop in places like Cuba.
Julian, I think we all agree that the Latin America for China is just a minor operation. But with all what has happened in Iran, can we expect probably more activities on China in the region? How do you see that?
So sorry, it's not. South America is not Latin America is not a minor player for China, a minor concern. It's actually a pretty big concern in some countries. So we just need to differentiate, where they are most present and where they're not. And so what we've seen over the past 15 years is gradually China overtaking, many as a trade partner, the US on many of the on several of the countries, making investments across a lot of other countries, and so in some countries it's really present. I go back into when we first had the podcast in talking about the Bolivian elections. The winning president again was what I would call the most ideal president for both the US and China. He was coming with a pro-business attitude, relatively speaking, compared to the former administration. But at the same time, his background and that of his president father and so on was more on the socialist spectrum, which is closer to China to some extent. He came out of nowhere, doing things on TikTok, which is a Chinese social media. Now, I don't want to play too much of, I don't know what algorithms are doing or not, but knowing that TikTok's been banned from India, has been banned from the US, who's taking over that social media, there may be some interference or some ways to do things and promote certain things. So I would say that in some countries they are really, really present, and that. But the Chinese are generally not confrontational in the same way that the gung-ho American or the Russian would be, like we've seen in the former in different settings. But have been generally adverse of going abroad, but have to because of the size of population, the size of the economy. They depend on a lot of the outside resources to sustain itself as a power. And so I would say that it would take a very different approach across a lot of countries. So what I think is what they are starting to understand, and probably see it, is that it's not just that the Trump administration is aggressive, is that it's executing a plan. All of these moves are coordinated, are planned ahead, and the execution is happening. What happened with Maduro was an extraordinary, piece of evidence that the execution of the plan was just spotless. You could call it, a predetermined, movie show, or whatever it is, but it was just extraordinary in the way that it happened. And so we can see this again and again across the board. And so I think this is what is taking perhaps by surprise, and certainly that Europe, everyone's just doesn't know where to stand. but in countries where you have unified power, such as in China, I think they realize that on the board game of world of geopolitical factors, things are moving really fast everywhere, and that's by design. It's not by fluke or just one action there or whatever. There is a coordinated attack across everywhere. And so there will be a reaction at some stage. I think I would say that for me, the simple reaction, as I mentioned before, was a energy for drones trade. They will keep on. China is a big producer of drones. They're very cheap. We can just give so many to Iran just to maintain, just to keep at it and keep being a nuisance to the Americans, as long as the Americans keep on there. So I think that's possibly at play. They depend on the energy to some extent there, but they have trade relations with other Middle Eastern countries who also see that China is a big consumer of the energy. So there's a lot of things happening there at the moment. So I think they for the I would imagine that they for the time being they're quite supportive of to some extent. I'm not saying so overtly, of course, but just on the pure business side, just sending the drones or whatever it is, to the Iranians. But at the same time, if the Iranian regime wants to keep at it and makes a deal with China, I remember, I worked many years in China, and I remember many people going, very senior people going to Iran to make business deals for infrastructure investments and oil pipe, whatever it is, China was investing over there. And so I think this is not a Venezuela case. It's not something, this is a strategic partner for the Chinese, and so it won't go down so easily. For Latin America, I think we'll start to see some movements over the next year about what it means, or whether the Chinese decide to do something about it. And of course, things that are a bit different, because you have history behind. You have a lot of history in Latin America, and that in the way that the Chinese are perceived. You have the confrontation between Maria Azul or Red One, whichever way that you decide. So there's a lot of moving parts over there. All that we know is that there have been a huge amount of investments. Some of these countries are very heavily dependent are still dependent on Chinese trade, and all making a lot of money over there. So there are factions within each of these countries which would have a pro or anti stance about for the Chinese. And of course that's why you need to go deeper at a sub level or sectoral level to understand where the play is going to be over the coming years.
just one thing with this position of China. It's really interesting because I agree with you, Julian and Andrew. There is a strategy behind the U.S., and clearly this strategy is trying to in a way neutralize the Chinese interests all across the world, and Latin America is not foreign to this. What happened in Panama has to do a little bit to try to neutralize the influence of China in infrastructure, especially in the channel. But also before the summit, and I think it's important to mention that just 4 days before the summit on the 26th of February, the representative committee of China published a report about how China is controlling the satellite stations all across Latin America, like giving a warning, says this has to be enacted. So a little bit what I'm saying is we are seeing this kind of news that sometimes looks like disconnected, and then we are seeing that there is a strategy behind in order to neutralize around that. And I'm asking myself on the other side, you're right, China will not, so far has not a confrontational approach all across Latin America. It's a quiet influence. But we are seeing a clear action of the US try to neutralize. And I agree. I don't think China is going to stay very quiet on all this. I wonder what are going to be the next move of China from now on, seeing this kind of pressure that is going to come from the side of the US.
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing out to something very interesting here, is because we've seen this before. If you remember, several years ago, just before, I think it was Trump as well, but when the US administration someone was about to go to Argentina, and suddenly you had this big, massive, sort of power cutoff across Argentina. Now, power cutoff can happen, usually in where infrastructure is not great and in certain countries. But when your entire infrastructure is built and run by a Chinese operator, you have to wonder if there was some kind of message at the time, to powers be that, okay, yes, the US is coming and say all these things, but remember, we are here. And I think, that's the type of thing that we may see all over. But again, it's, if to some extent, say, if a country goes all the way to be pro-Trump and pro-administration, sells its some of its goods, but as long as the Chinese still have access to the trades and the business and extract what they want to extract, then things are okay. They're happy to. The Chinese play a much longer term than the US in that sense. So this is where we'll see or we won't see any actions that if soya keeps on being exported to the Chinese pigs, and they will be happily continue doing trades there if they can still get enough energy from Latin America or mineral resources, then they will keep on doing. As long as some of the key inputs are not disrupted and doesn't cause a strategic problem for them, we'll see pushback if some of these things are cut off. Certainly, some real pushback.
Let's move a little bit our analysis. Let's go back to the electoral elements that, again, is all interrelated. But Sunday there was legislative elections in Colombia with some surprising results. And I think the Iran effect has been feeling, at least the center has not been favored with the results around that. There is polarization in the country, a fragmented Congress we're going to see.
Yeah.
But left that everybody thought was in trouble suddenly performed better, the party of Gustavo Petro, than expected in that line, and in a way reinforced the candidacy of Cepeda in Colombia. But on the other side, the Uribistas with the Centro Democrático, correct me, Andrew, please, the name of the party,
that's
performed really well in that area, and becomes another winner on this. So we are seeing the extremes and polarization in Colombia. But what is your view? For one thing, I think in a way the discourse of Petro against the U.S. intervention in Iran favored him a little bit in the electoral term. But seen a little bit in the medium and long term, how do you see all these developments in Colombia and the implications at regional level as well?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, and I'll have to stick to it, that the next president of Colombia is going to be one of three people. It could be Iván Cepeda, the representative of the party in power, which seems to be doing, as you were saying, surprisingly well. The position on Iran might be part of it, but also Petro pushed through a 23% increase in the minimum wage, which will convince perhaps a number of voters to switch for him. So that's one name. The other name is Paloma Valencia, who's a former senator from the Centro Democrático partner. So she's traditional right, supported by former President Uribe. In the congressional and primary elections, which were held last weekend, she did very, very well, surprising a lot of people who thought she wasn't going to come up. She got more than 2 million votes. And the third person who could be president, I think, is Abelardo de la Espriella, who is he's a far-right figure, a far-right lawyer, very, very conservative in cultural values. The argument there is he did less well than expected, and there are a number of allegations around him. As a defense lawyer, he worked with some perhaps unsavory people. So he might not do that well. All that points to a possible runoff later this year between Paloma Valencia and Iván Cepeda. That will be a really important election because it's, again, if you like, a reflection of polarization. If Iván Cepeda wins, he will clash with with the Trump, going a few decades wrong there. He will clash with the Trump administration. If Paloma Valencia comes in, she will be seen as strengthening the swing to the right that we've been seeing going across Latin America. And as you're saying, everything is connected because at issue is Colombia's policy against drugs and cartels and its attempt to pacify the country, which has so far not created success. So the next 6 months will be critical for determining Colombia's future.
Julian, what are your views?
About Colombia, we've seen lots of discussion now. We've seen some tough talks coming from the US and on the current incumbent president. We understand there's tough talks also from the summit. We understand there's things that it's a big country. There's both oil reserves and also one of, as Andrew mentioned, the biggest cocaine producer. And so it's a really critical place, I would think, for the US. So there's going to be increased pressure, certainly, but at the same time, what I think is very important here is always to remember that the US doesn't seem to care who's in power as long as they can, as long as they have a friendly year and they can operate, have a US first. If they are prepared to have a US first, then that's fine. So But I think Colombia is a place where, for instance, we may see, we may see Chinese perhaps interference here in some covert way. Um, there's interest over there. There's a lot of I think this could be an interesting point where we'll see how this goes towards the elections. I would love to interview some of the people in Colombia, as you know. But,
Yeah, that's true. I would be a little bit controversial here around, but there is one thing that comes to me. The U.S. policy so far at regional level, hard approach against the drugs, militarization of the drug efforts. Also, as you say, decapitation policies to try to put some friendly governments around on those elements, but also, as Julian mentioned very well, the U.S. doesn't care who is in power as long as is doing what the Americans want them to do. But if we're pushing this in the Colombia scenario, drugs, then the position in Iran sounds a little bit that has been strengthened the position of the left with the candidate Cepeda. So it could backfire a little bit on the American strategy. That's probably the controversial element. On the other side is there are three players in the game and probably one kingmaker that we have to mention this in the Colombian elections, whose name is Juan Daniel Oviedo, who was a former director of the Statistic Institute in Colombia and who performed really well after Valencia. He's from the line of Uribe. And many saying in Colombia that an alliance between these two could bring the Uribe approach around, and that will be a gain for the U.S. in a way. So I'm going this following the kind of answers that Andrew was mentioning around that, the contradictory approaches. For one side, the U.S. policy is not performing in the way that they want to like, but on the other side, we can see probably a positive effect towards the U.S. With this, I would like for you, because we are basically covering almost all the elements, to make a wrap up from what's coming in the front. There are a lot of elements. What we will need to see now from now on at the Latin American level. Just giving a little bit, there is the Cuba situation. That's what I'm saying. We have to pay attention also the trial of Maduro, that there is an audience on the 17th of March. And so we're going to be interesting because looks like the U.S. fiscal, the accusation is trying to manage this at reserve level, because there is a lot of reserve interests, confidential information that could be discussed through this trial. So it's going to be interesting to see what is going to happen there and how it's evolving through the region. And on the other side, also, I would say we will need to see the consequences still of the war in Iran. I think we're seeing how long it's going to take, but there are economic implications for those who are net importers and big gains for those who are producers in the way. It's funny because you mentioned in Colombia, Petro has used probably the benefit of the oil prices to favor his position.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the line. So how do you see what we need to look in the next couple of weeks?
I think in a way I'm just repeating what you said. It's the war in Iran and how long does it go on for, which I think is a critical thing, as we were saying earlier. It's elections in Peru, elections in Colombia, and elections in Brazil, all of which are happening later on this year. and will determine, if you like, whether the swing to the right continues swinging or not. And there is a more general picture, I think, about the policy against crime and corruption throughout Latin America. But slightly going back to the Shield of the Americas summit, they talked in general principles, things that people can perhaps agree with, but there was no clear strategy of how you fight crime and begin to reduce it on a continental level. And some fear that we're basically going through the war on drugs of the 1970s and 1980s, except that now it's the regional or international war on drugs across Latin America. The first war on drugs was a major failure, so there are reasonable fears that the second one, or the Trump one, may run into difficulties, and that just calling in airstrikes is not enough to solve the problem.
Julian, your views?
Yeah, no, I agree with all that being said. And I just had a thought just now. I mean, in a very cynical thought again, but talking about the war on drugs, one of the impacts of war on drugs has it destabilizes a country massively, right? So we take what happened to in Mexico, some intelligence, and then suddenly eruption, cartel wars, value grabbing, and so on. And so it's really negative for the country and for the powers, and for the state, which appears powerless to some extent. And so if in this scenario we think about Colombia, if someone who is not pro-US or not aligned with the US as much as the US would hope so, and then being a democratic country, then the US will probably not do a similar fate as it did to Maduro. It will take the president, elected president, but aiming for the head of a criminal organization or something is another way of creating a kind of blackmailing of the powers there, and I think that's that's not to be underestimated. One of the key things that's underlying all of this, is of course that we see more and more, whether it's in Iran or Venezuela or anywhere, is that the three-letter Friends word, starting with C and ending with A, and across seem to be really active across everywhere, and that's that's a key thing, I think, for to be watchful for going into the Colombian election or the Peruvian elections or any elections happening, or anything happening in the Latin world.
With this, I think we are at the end of this episode. Once again, it has been a real pleasure talking with you guys. As always, we're going to see much more coming across. We are all in agreement. It's really exciting times in Latin America for all what's going on. We are seeing a lot of changes, a lot of trends going around, and we will continue doing this analysis and trying to understand what is happening in our region and how it's connected to the rest of the world. With this, Julian, Andrew, thank you very much, and until the next time. Bye-bye.